But before we get there, we need to have a picture. Got to have a picture. This is our picture today. Dun, 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 dun. One of the scariest surfing pictures I have ever seen in my life. And I think, you're saying, well, I've seen bigger waves. I think I've seen bigger waves in pictures too. But it's just the nasty, black, huge volume of this water. And I don't know if you can see it if you got your glasses on. Right in the center there's a guy having fun. For a minute, exactly. And in fact, when I looked at this picture, it said that, when he crashed, he definitely crashed out this, it dislocated both of his shoulders and he had some cracked ribs. And I'm thinking, yeah, exactly. But right then he was going, hoo-hoo. And then it all fell apart. Why a surfing picture in a nasty, nasty, dangerous situation? Because in the end of Hebrews 10, he's saying that that's sometimes what we think about doing. Well, in a sense, metaphorically. Okay, so here we are. This is how we're going to get our... well, that was kind of nice. Do that again. Oh, never mind. Okay, here we are. Here's the chapters of Hebrews. We've been working away from the very beginning, and we've gotten up to this end of chapter 10. It's the beginning of the following Yeshua. Yeshua is a Hebrew way of saying Jesus. We're right today at the beginning of what we mean about following Jesus as a result of all the 10 chapters we've read so far. So it's as though, okay, this is the So What Sunday, the beginning of the So What Sunday. We've had 10 chapters of understanding who Jesus really is as our high priest, what he's really done on our behalf, and so what do we do to follow? So we're right at the beginning of that today. And he's going to hearken back to something we've talked about before, but he's going to say something, that's why I have a red blinker right there. He's going to say, I can tell you how to follow Jesus, but today I'm going to tell you how to not follow Jesus. We're going to start with a contrast. Don't do this, and the next week he'll tell us what to do. So the first contrast is going to say, don't do this. And he'll remind us of something that he talked about very seriously back at the beginning of the book, back way over here in chapter 2. Okay? He said back in chapter 2, remember that verse that just stunned us? Well, some of us. Here it is right here. Chapter 2, verse 3. How will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Remember that? How will we escape if we neglect so great? And he's talking about the salvation that comes through Jesus and who he uniquely is. You can look at the entire world of possible salvation scenarios, Buddha, Hindu, whatever you want. You can talk about all those, but he says, you know what? If you ignore this one, how do you plan to escape? You got an alternate route out? And remember, we talked about the fact that it's an imagery. This is what it made me think of. Is this sign that you see on the Oregon and Washington coast, California too. When you get very close to the shore right there, there's these signs that say tsunami hazard zone. In case of an earthquake, go to high ground or inland. Woohoo! Right? And it made me think of this because that's exactly how it works. If I tell you, if you're on the Oregon coast and you hear a tsunami warning, you don't say, well, I'm not sure I really believe that. You react to what you hear, and the next thing you do is you put your understanding of the threat into your feet, and you go to high ground. That's what the sign says. It's even showing you if you don't speak English, right? So the issue is, if you're on the Oregon coast and you get a tsunami warning, and you decide to ignore it, how are you going to save yourself? That's why, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? It's a matter of hearing and understanding, and putting your understanding into your feet and moving. Okay? How will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Getting close to the surfing picture. Can you feel it? Because over here in chapter 10, he starts it off by saying this in verse 26 today. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, so he's going to say, you received the knowledge of the truth. You heard this tsunami warning go up. Tsunami. You heard that. But then you decide to go back to the beach and willfully continue sinning. That's how he's putting it. Then it's just like, it's just like our picture a second ago. And instead of saying you should run for the high ground, what you're doing actually is you should be looking at this sign instead, which they put for idiots. When you hear tsunami warning, don't think it's a great day to surf. Okay, you got this? So this is the imagery he's trying to tell us. Beginning, he said, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? And today he's going to say, and you're entertaining the idea of going back to the beach and surfing in this wave of judgment that's coming. What are you thinking? See, so this is how not to follow Jesus. He's going to start off with how not to follow Jesus. Don't go back and say that the judgment of God, the tsunami of God in that particular sense, is a great day to get out on your board and really enjoy yourself. Because in the end, like the guy in the picture, is destruction. So he's just going to sober us up a little bit before he talks about really following Jesus and say, don't do it this way. So here's the don't do it this way stuff today. He starts in verse 26. We already looked at it. If we go on sinning willfully, that means like I'm choosing to do it. I'm waxing my board. I'm going back to the beach. If we go on sinning after receiving the knowledge of the truth, after you know what's coming down, and here's another sobering line, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment. Now, this morning is going to fly in the face of the popular cultural notion that goes like this. I believe in God. I believe in a very loving God who loves us with a capacity to love more than any of us will ever understand. I don't think God would ever send anyone to hell. He loves us too much. Now, that's a very popular notion these days. And I've heard it on many cultural, ideological fronts, is that. And it's more of someone saying to themselves, I prefer to think of the God that I prefer to think about as being so good that he'll never be judgmental. And so if you're really a follower of God, you will not judge. Well, that's all extraordinarily flawed, it turns out. All flawed. We have a God who is simultaneously very loving. And yes, loving more than you could ever conceive in your entire life. Paul says, in one of his letters, he says, I just can't even start to describe how boundless his love for us, what the depth of it is, the width of it, the height of it, the length. I just can't even start to tell you the dimensions of his love. But to the same degree that God is loving, he's also quite just. He's very just. And now to do kind of a reminder of why those have to go hand in hand, think of yourself in a family context is what I do. I think about my wife and my children and say some murderous guy just barges in the front door. He's going to come and he's going to take the life of my kids or my wife or something like that. I mean, just incredible harm. But I love my children. Would I take the attitude, an unjust attitude where I say, well, I know you're just having a hard day today. I really love you a whole lot. So go right ahead and do what it is you ever want to do. Now, that would be loving toward him. But would that be loving toward my family? No, because love is saying, I prefer the best. I desire the best for someone. I'm consumed with figuring out the best for them. And best means judging between good and evil, and putting away the evil and preferring the good for them. So love and justice have to go hand in hand, or else love actually has no power to it. But we have a God who is equally loving, equally just. And at the end of the age, we'll see this giant tsunami at the end of the age is coming, where his justice, which up to this point has been somewhat deferred, will then go into full practice. And there will be people on the wrong side of judgment. There will be. And not just a few, not just the Hitlers, an extraordinarily high percentage of mankind. Now, I'm not just making this up. Well, let's read and see. Remember, we read the word and see what it says. But what he's saying right here is, listen, we've taught you about the fact that God's justice indeed at the end of the age is going to come down. It's going to happen. It really, really is going to happen. Jesus is going to come back and in love collect together those of us who love him, but there will be judgment against those who are not aligned with God. You see, and you understand that. You've heard that. You've got the knowledge in your head. So what are you doing returning to a life that is without God and in the midst of the sinfulness that is just going to be destroyed in the tsunami of judgment at the end? Why would you stay in that? Why aren't you fleeing from that? Following Jesus is about not only running from that, but running to him, is what he's going to say right now. So don't go back playing with that stuff. Now he's going to expand on that a little bit. He quotes for us from the Old Testament right here. A terrifying expectation of judgment, and from Isaiah 26, the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. This is the kind of justice God has. Our God is a consuming fire. I know it's not a popular thing to talk about, but God is an extraordinarily just God. Don't play with the tsunami. He goes on. He says in verse 28, anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's kind of a funny phrase, the way he says it. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses. That is, I do the simple thing. The law of Moses, let's just call that the 10 Commandments. Anyone who takes the 10 Commandments and sets them aside and says, I don't need to do that, right? Basically a lawless person. I don't need to do that. I can do whatever I want to do. Okay? So whoever sets aside that law of what's good and bad, what's righteous and what's not, you'd step away from that. What does he say the consequences are? Dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses is an Old Testament convention. It's a way of making sure that you didn't suffer the consequences of unjust accusations. If 2 or 3 people come and say, yeah, he did that, yeah, he did that, yeah, he did that, then that was convicting. That was convicting. He's saying, listen, what you're doing when you're talking about going back and playing in the cesspool of this life of sin, surfing on the wave, basically, it's worse than you can possibly imagine. In fact, it's so worse if you just did this, if you just set aside the law of Moses. It just takes 2 or 3 people to say, that's what he's doing. And that's the end. That's how easy judgment is in that particular sense. And that's black and white. There's no grays right there. There's no grays. So if it was that easy in the Old Testament sense, someone who is a deliberate person who sets aside and says, I will live a lawless life, and it only takes 2 or 3 people to convict you to death, what you're contemplating right now is so much worse. How will you escape if you neglect so great a salvation? It's miles worse. That's the easy judgment. Now look at this, he says. Well, how much severe punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? So what you're contemplating doing when you're talking about going back to this old life, now you understand who Jesus is. You understand what he's done on your behalf. But there's something about you that hasn't fully embraced him. There's something about you that wants to stay back in the old life. Listen, if it was easy to convict you under the laws of Moses, look what you're doing now. You're not just setting aside the laws of Moses. You're actually saying that what Jesus did for you, the Son of God, you're trampling that underfoot. Now remember, we spent the last, 8 chapters talking about what he's done to solve the problem of our own sin, sacrificing himself for us. When you go out and you say, well, I'm just going to do what I want to do. I don't really need a sacrifice for myself. What he's saying is that in a real sense, you're taking the sacrifice of Jesus himself on the cross, his blood shed for you, and you're just trampling on it and going your own way. I don't need that. Do my own thing. You're saying that what Jesus did on your behalf means nothing, and I'm going to deliberately just ignore it. I don't need it. I don't need it. Well, now you're talking serious stuff. You're talking much more than just setting aside the law of Moses. Now you're actually repudiating the costly sacrificial love on your behalf exhibited by God to solve the problem of your sin. You're saying, I don't think I really have a problem. I don't really need Jesus' sacrifice. See that? That's how serious it is. And has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant. That's the blood we've been talking about that Jesus shed for us, by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace. Take the word grace and put the word gift, because grace and gift are very similar. Grace is something given that you don't deserve, you don't earn. The Spirit of the gift. And then can you understand how absolutely not obnoxious this is? You're saying basically, I understand that God has done this by grace as a free gift to me. He's taken the initiative. He's done this on my behalf. And what I'm doing now is I've insulted the very giver of this costly gift, this grace to me. That's how much I don't need it. And in the end, judgment will look a lot like this issue, basically. There'll be people who come before God at judgment, and they'll say, well, I've lived a pretty good life. Not a perfect life. That would be prideful and boastful for me to say that. But I've lived a very good life. I mean, in the balance of things, I look back, I see the bad things I did, and they were bad. I don't care. But, I've done a lot of good. So on the balance of life, God, I look at the scales of my life and say, wow, I did a lot more good than I did bad. Yeah. And if you don't think that's true, God, let me tell you about my brother. He was really worse. I mean, he did so many bad things. He didn't do any good things. So, compared to him, I think I'm up at the top of the heap, but, whatever you think, God, but I think I'm one of the worthy ones. Now, that's a very dangerous position to be in front of God. Because what you're saying is, I deserve to be in your heaven because of what I've accomplished on my own. It doesn't matter what Jesus has accomplished for me. It basically takes what I've accomplished and puts it on the same grounds as what Jesus accomplished. Jesus did a good work, but yeah, I did a lot of good works myself too. And that is insulting the spirit of the gift of grace. Do you see that? There will be people who try and stand in front of a holy God that way and say, on the basis of what I've done, I should get in. But all you're doing is fulfilling this. You've trampled underfoot the Son of God. I didn't really need him. And it'll come down to who is it you're trusting in the end? Your own sense of goodness? Or are you trusting in what Jesus did on your behalf as a free gift of grace, something you never could earn, no ever could even try to pay back? And you say, you know what? I don't deserve to be here, God, really. But you came and you paid the price on my behalf when I couldn't do it for myself. I'm just riddled with sin. There's nothing I can do to fully expiate all that sin. I just can't do it. But God, I want you more than anything else. More than everything else, I want you. And you solve the problem of my own sinfulness by you dying on my behalf in Jesus. That's the only reason why I stand here. Not because of what I've done, but because of what you have done on my behalf. I honor what the Son of God has done. And I'm still amazed at the spirit of grace, the spirit of gift that has come to me. And that will work on Judgment Day. That will work. It really all comes down to who is Jesus. Did Jesus come to pay a price on your behalf? Or was he just a good teacher and now you have to pay the price yourself by doing good works for the rest of your life? And that's really going to be the contrast when we get down to it. And he's saying right here, how will you escape if you neglect this kind of salvation, the Son of God who died for you, the blood that was spilled on your behalf to cleanse you and to sanctify you, to make you holy, to make you not like this place anymore? How are you going to get there if you completely neglect this? Because what you're doing is this, very actively. You're actually putting down the Son of God, what he came to do, and you're elevating yourself. You're surfing on a tsunami, and you're going to plummet. You're not going to get there. Kind of sobering today, isn't it? but he's saying, this is what it's all about. If in your life of quote-unquote thinking you're following Jesus, if you're always thinking about going back to that beach, going back to that old life, that life of living sin, of living independently, not needing Jesus, if you think that's a better deal. Now remember, he used a great metaphor for us in the beginning, middle section of this book. He talked about the Israelites when they left Egypt. Remember that? The Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years as slaves to the Egyptians. God got them out of there. The first Passover, the firstborn died. He got the Israelites out of there, and he traced them across the desert and headed them up to the land of his promise. My promises are over here. I promise you I'm going to give you a land where you'll have vineyards that you didn't plant. You'll have wheat fields that you didn't plant. You're going to have houses you didn't build. I have this for you. This is my promised place. I'm sending you to this promised place. Right? Remember that? Now, it should have been happily ever after. But what happens? They get on the brink of the outside of that place of God's promises. And they say, well, let's send in some spies. The spies go in and check out the land. They come back and go, oh, there's giants in the land. Right? There's giants there. 2 of the spies out of the 10 said, don't sweat it. Don't sweat it. Don't forget who our God is. And by the way, when our God makes a promise, it will happen, giants or no giants. But they decided to believe the 10 who said, but there's giants. Which is in effect is saying, okay, God may have promised us that place a long time ago, but now that we got here, you know what? I'm really not too sure he can pull this off because after all, there's giants. And what you're saying is that God's promises, remember I read you in Isaiah 55, his word, which does not come back void. It does what it says. His word, his promise, they're saying that God really can't fulfill his promises. Maybe he's not strong enough to fulfill his promises, because after all, there's giants. Or maybe he's lost his love for us. He's capable, but he doesn't want to do it anymore, because after all, we're out here in the desert, and it's really a bad life out here, and we could have died back in Egypt. We shouldn't have to die out here. So maybe he's stopped loving us. So either he's incapable, and he loves us, or he doesn't love us, and he's capable and doesn't want it. So he can't or he won't. That's what they said on the brink of the land of God's promises. Either God can't or he won't. Regardless, his word is not going to come true. Okay, he may have promised that, but I think he's reneging. So, the next best thing to the land of promises is not to stay in this stinking desert right here. Let's go back to Egypt. Woohoo! Because they had food there and it was a nice place, the Nile Delta. Okay, we were slaves. That's kind of a downside to the whole thing. But after all, if we're going to die, let's die where we have food rather than right here in the middle of the desert. Right? Doesn't that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. And that's what he's talking about right here. Why would you, on the brink of God's promises coming to fruition in your life, why would you say, I think I want to go back? Why would you do that? And don't say, well, I would never do that. Yes, you would. The Israelites did it, which means we would do it. But what would cause you in the midst of your life right now to say, I think I'd rather go back to a life of sin, a life, and that's what Egypt is meant to be a metaphor. I think I want to go back to that. I want to go back to a life without God. And why would I be tempted to do that? The only thing that would tempt you to do that is if your current circumstances, right now where you sit, you say, you know what? God promised himself to me, but he's not proven it in the midst of my circumstance right now. In fact, I'm feeling like I live in a desert. I feel like life stinks. I feel like God's not loving me right now. So I'm going to be tempted to think that the promise of life with him right after this is not going to really happen. I'm thinking God might have fallen out of love with me. I'm thinking God might have forgotten about me. I'm thinking maybe God isn't powerful to make his promises good. So I think it's not worth persisting, waiting on the fulfilled promises of God to happen, because my present circumstances are tempting me to think that God's just reneging on the deal. So I think I'll go back to a life without God. It's exactly the same as what happened in the desert. Exactly. And what he's saying to them is, some of you are actually thinking this way. After you've heard all that, you've come to an understanding of the entire plan and of God's promises fulfilled in you in the present, and big time after you die in the end. Big time. Full fruition, God's promises. Like a promised land in that sense. Why would you think about going back to what life was like before without God? If you want to follow Jesus, if you understand the 10 chapters of what I've just been teaching, he said, you would never in a million years go back to a life without God. Not when you understand that people who live in that zone are in the tsunami danger area. Judgment is coming. There is no life there. In fact, justice has been withheld for a while, but pretty soon that wave is coming. And all mankind who do not put their trust in God are going to suffer the bad side of that judgment. Don't go back to a life without God. His promises are almost ready to pop into full fruition. Now, he does also tell us, remember we talked about the fact that as our high priest we have now access in the presence of God. He says in chapter 4 that access will be in fulfillment, in reality, in big time at the end of the age. Remember where he has a new city coming down. He'll live in the midst of us. We'll live around him. He'll enjoy living in our midst, and we'll have access to him. It's really cool. It's like access into the temple in that sense. That's going to happen in the end of time. But right now you can even do that. Chapter 4, remember that? I quote this over and over again. He gave us the big hint about the end. He says, let us, therefore, draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we might receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. That means now. So we have access to the presence of God now, and at the end of the age, even more access in this promise place of life with him. Life now, and life like you can't believe later. But you say, yeah, but still, life right now kind of stinks. I feel like I'm living in a desert. God's not really proven to me that he really wants to bring life. So what do you say to that? What do you say to the Israelites while they're out in the desert? Just a day's march into the land of God's promises. What do you say to them as their feet and their sandals are on the hot sand and they're saying, we could die back in Egypt. Why did he bring us out here to kill us out in the sand? What do you say to them? Say, God's with us. He's with us. See that cloud over there? See that fire at night? He's with us. His promises are good. He will fulfill his promises to us for life. It may not look like it's right there now, but he's with us right now. We have access right now to God. Come near the throne of grace to receive mercy. Right? We can do that right now. And in the end of time, even more. If you want God, then you'll find life. If you don't want God, you'll never find life. That's all he's saying. It's as simple as that. How much severe punishment do you think he'll deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? I don't need Jesus and I don't want a life with God. Let's push on. Verse 30. As if that weren't enough to really sober you. Verse 30. We know him. Talking about God. The God who's incredibly loving and the God who's just. We know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Deuteronomy 32. That's God speaking. That's God speaking in the context, especially when you're in a situation where an unjust thing happens and maybe you're the one that gets hurt because of it. You ever had someone take advantage of you? Lie to you, do something that hurts you, does something that takes away from you in a real sense, and you cry out and say, God, where's the justice? When will you correct this situation? Do you even see the injustice right here? Oh, he does. He does. He sees it. And someday that justice will come down on that act. And who does that? Vengeance is mine, says God. God says, I'm the one who keeps track of all this stuff. Nothing goes without me seeing it. Especially the stuff that hurts the ones I love. I'm watching. I'm watching. You don't need to go out and take retribution on your own, God says. I'm watching. I see it all. Nothing's slipping by. Vengeance is mine. I will repay. Or he goes on. And again, from Deuteronomy 32, the Lord will judge his people. Yikes. And as if that weren't enough, it's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So, you want to go back to a life without God? You want to go back and try surfing this tsunami of judgment? You think that's really a smart idea? Because you think that big wave that guy was getting caught in is going to trash him. It's a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of a living God. Judgment really is coming. God does not put up with injustice infinitely. A day is coming when he'll say, that's it. We're closing the books on all the injustice. And thank God that although all of us, all mankind, are on the bad side of this judgment, some of us, by the grace of God, have understood that he's paid the price on our behalf. He's paid the debt that we should have paid at judgment for us by dying for us. It's not anything that we do. It's not that we're better than anybody else. It's the fact that we've said, the blood of Christ has paid my behalf. And I believe who he is, and I embrace who he is. And I want God more than everything else. You do not want to start a life without God right now and then end up in the tsunami of his judgment at the end of the age, because it's a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of a living God. Now that kind of flies in the face of this cultural thing I was talking about earlier, doesn't it? Oh, God just loves me. He's like a big kind of warm bear in the sky. We hug each other, and he understands I'm pretty much good. And, he wouldn't do anything about my injustices because he loves me. Oh. That's a lie from Satan. It's a lie from Satan. We have a God who is holy and just set apart from this fallen creation of sin, this selfish-oriented world that says, I'm God, I'll do my own thing. There is no creator. He didn't give me life and breath. I'm going to do my own thing, be my own person. I'm going to grab all the gusto, which, if you're younger than 40, you know what that means. But I'm going to grab all the gusto, and I'm going to do everything my own way, and I'm my own God, and I don't think God exists, and if he does, who cares? Well, you should care, because it's a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of a living God. Justice is coming. And as much as his heart is broken by that, by the people who willfully say, God, I don't want you, who basically flip him off in their lives, as much as that breaks his heart, it's because he loves them. People during the time of Peter, when Peter wrote some of his letters, says, Peter, listen, here's the deal. Jesus said he was coming back pretty soon, but you know what? It's been a long time, and, well, I don't know. Maybe he's not going to come back. What's the deal? And Peter writes and says, well, listen, it's not as though God's dragging his feet, but the deal is he wants the most people to come to him. He's not desirous that any should perish. So he's waiting this thing out a little bit longer because some will come to understand who he is. He's not desirous that any should perish. That's why he's hanging it out. And he's kind of hung it out now for 2,000 years. So I'm not desirous that any should perish. But some will perish because of justice. That's why Jesus, when he had his midnight in the dark discussion with Nicodemus, the man of religious power and authority, and Nicodemus is sitting there and he's saying, come on, teacher, tell me, give me the core stuff. Core stuff. He says, here's the core stuff. God so loved the world, including you, Nicodemus. God so loved the world that he gave his only son, me. Right? You know this verse, don't you? And why? So that we wouldn't perish. That's the end of that verse. So we wouldn't perish. There is a time of perishing coming. It's this. And if you willfully go back and live a life without God and say, it's not going to happen, surf the tsunami and find out. See, that's what he's saying. Don't go back to that. It's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of a living God. But, before we get too negative, that's pretty negative. He says, listen, let me remind you, remember this guy in this little sign right here? That's you. There was a time in which you had this right and you're doing the right stuff. So don't forget, let's go back to what you remember when you first came to know me. He says this, verse 32. But remember the former days, when after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings. Good for you. Partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations. People made fun of you. They beat you up and stuff like that. And partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners, and you accepted joyfully, there it goes, and you accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. So he says, I remember you guys. I remember when you first heard this message. And I remember how unpopular it was to kind of settle up and say, I'm with Jesus, and I'm following Jesus, and I'm going wherever Jesus is, and I'm going to the end of the age to where his promises are. I'm with him. That's my life. And how you suffered, how you got beat up, how people said nasty things about you. Jesus follower, and you put up with all that kind of stuff. But you said, no, I'm following Jesus. I'm following his promises. It's going to happen. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Oh, you're just a twerp. You're an idiot, And you put up with all that stuff. And you put up with all your stuff being taken. That's how unpopular it was. I'm a follower of Jesus. Great. We're going to take your entire house, all your lands, everything you own. And you said to yourself, it's okay. It's a good trade. It's a good trade because I'll be so much more rich in Jesus now and in eternity. It's a good trade. Take it. Take it. I want Jesus. That stuff doesn't play. Because you knew that for yourselves you had a better possession and a lasting one. When the people of Israel left the captivity of Egypt and they're walking out from their Egyptian captors and they're walking out of opulence. You're walking out of, high culture, the New York City of the world at the time. You're talking about wealthy places. You may be a slave, but you're living in a pretty good place. But as you walked out of that and you left that behind, you made the conscious decision to say, you know what? This is a pretty neat life I'm in, but I'm going to walk away from that. I'm going to leave that all behind. Ahead of me, all I see is sand. But I know that on the other side of the sand, there's a lasting possession that's based on God's promises. And in the same way, when we walk away from a life without God, a life that's just infused with sin, that has really some benefits of pretty hot life sometimes. Come on, you have to admit a life of sin has some incredible cultural and material benefits sometimes. You live like a king, But you're saying, you know what? I'm going to leave all that behind. Not because I'm just kind of an ascetic kind of guy and I can live without that, but because I'm aiming towards something that's a good trade for, a lasting possession based on the promises of God. That's what he's saying. You did this. You understood this. You understood it was a good trade. You walked away. You put up with all the ridicule. Remember that person? That was you. Remember that person? Remember Israel, how you walked out of those houses in Egypt and said, I don't need these guys. I have God, and I have his promises. And the Egyptians went, you're going to die in the desert. Right? And when you followed God now, people say, and they used to say this during my generation a long time, Jesus freaks. You're Jesus freaks. You're all weird. It's all about Jesus. And you'd say, well, yeah, it is. It is. He's promised abundant life, and I'm taking him at his word. And if that means losing all this stuff, walking away from that stuff, yeah, that's okay. It's a great trade. Yeah, but it's just his promises. Yeah, but you know what? His promises come true. They come true. His love for me will actualize now and into the future like you just can't believe. I'm going to leave all that stuff behind. So what are you doing going back to that stuff? Just don't do that. You walked away. Now that you've walked away, follow. Follow. Go forward. Don't go back. Follow. You wisely fled when you understood this before. You were ridiculed and made fun of. And on top of that, you left everything as a trade for this. And it was a good thing for you. Remember, it was a good thing. So don't play with changing that decision. It'd be the same thing as the Israelites saying, I'm leaving Egypt, and marching out in the desert and saying, let's go back. No, don't do that. Go forward. Go forward. Walk on the promises of God. Go forward, what he says. Okay, need to wrap this up. Therefore, verse 35, don't throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. Again, put it back in the metaphor of the Israelites. Endure through the desert. Come on, the promise is just on the other side of that. Just keep moving. Go forward. Don't rethink your decision. Go forward. You just need endurance. Stick with it. Follow Jesus. Don't try and go back. And then he quotes from the Old Testament again, verse 37. For yet, in a very little while, he who is coming will come, and he will not delay. Verse 38, but my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So here he's putting in front of us the fundamental decision. You left Egypt. You left a life without God. You put that behind. You went to follow him. Okay? Now here's your choice. If you want to stick with following him and pursuing and holding him to his promises to you for abundant life, if you want that, you're going to have to do that through faith. If you don't want to do that and you'd rather go back to Egypt, go back to a life without God, you can shrink back. That's what it means. It means just to shrink back, go back. That's your choice right where you stand right now. Go forward and pursue the promises of God. Go backward and pursue life without God. What do you want to do? That's why he's starting this whole section on following Jesus, saying, come on, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue to pursue him? Or you want to shrink back? That's really your only question right now. But to pursue him takes faith. Now we're going to go back because faith is a big issue right now. Faith is me saying, I have a sense in which his promises for me are really going to happen. That's faith. I'm taking him at his word. And a lot of that faith is based on my understanding of who he is. Does God keep his word? Yes. Is God capable of enacting his word into reality? Yes. I know who God is. I know his track record. I know his love for me. Based on all those things about who God is, I have faith in him, so I have faith his promises will happen. In a funny way, faith gives me an assurance of what hasn't happened yet. It gives me an understanding and a confidence of what I can't see, but will be there. So he says that's our choice now. You want to follow Jesus? Walk by faith. Walk by expectation of those promises. And then he sums it up for us right here at the end of the chapter. But listen, we're not of those who shrink back. We're not shrinkers. It's like slackers. We're not shrinker-backers. That's not us. That's not you. I remember you when you first heard this word. We are not of those who shrink back to destruction, because that's what's back there. If you surf the tsunami of judgment, there's judgment back there. There's destruction. But of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. We're going forward. So here's the choice right here. You can either shrink back, and that leads to, what does he say in verse 39? Destruction. That's life without God. It's destruction, because judgment's coming. Or you can go forward in faith, and that is the preserving of the soul. It's life. That's the abundant life. Jesus says, I came that they might have life and that they might have it abundantly. That's the promise, right? That's your choice. You're in the center right there. Continue to pursue Jesus or go back to a life without him. Well, what do you want to do? That's what he's saying at the beginning of this section. So next week, he's going to say, let's leave this shrinking back stuff behind. Let's forget about that. I even talked about that. Let's go forward. So the issue is, what is faith? So the very first verse of the next section we'll go into next week is, faith is this. Because now we know that in order to pursue a life with God, somehow we have to do it exercising faith. Well, what is faith? So next week we'll bring our bridge back, we'll bring about a whole bunch of stuff, and we will show you people in the past, in the Old Testament, who understood the promises of God, understood the character of a loving and just God, and said, I want him, and I want to pursue his promises. I'm setting my sights. And you won't believe what they went through in order to follow Jesus, to follow God, because they exercised faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And in a time when you're waiting for the life of God to come to your life, you cling to that and say, God, your promises will happen. They did in the past, they will in the future. Your promises of life to me will happen. I want you and you alone. I'm willing to leave all this behind. I'm not going to go back and surf the tsunami. I'm going to follow you. So next week, that's what we're going to do. That's why faith will be a big issue next week. So last picture, here we go. I love this picture. This couple was riding a motorcycle in Australia and came upon a beach that had swallowed a car. Telling you that at other times of the year, the surf in this area can probably be dangerous, right? When you see a car that's kind of taken there. So keeping the metaphor in our mind, judgment is coming. There is a terrible storm that's coming for mankind. That if you haven't put your faith and trust in Jesus and wanting God alone, it's just going to sweep you away. Leave like carcasses in the sand like this. So when you come to places like this, be sobered a little bit and recognize that there is a sign posted here. And the sign says, this is a tsunami hazard zone. You don't want to stay here. And if you have news of the fact that a judgment is coming, run for the hills. In fact, do more than that. Run to Jesus. Run to Jesus. Be with him. That's where life is. That's the preserving of your soul. Follow him by faith. But the last thing you want to do is go surfing. Because it's a terrible thing to fall in the hands of a living God. Okay? That's how not to follow Jesus. Next week, how to follow him by faith. And some of the most incredible examples of people in the Old Testament who did this. What an encouragement. Okay? That's what we'll do. So let's quit. Father, we do indeed thank you for your word to us, the sobering nature of it to us. And Lord, this is sobering. Lord, I have to admit, I fall prey many times to this popular culture that says that God's too loving to ever send anyone to hell. And you are very loving. You're extraordinarily loving. You're not desirous that any should perish. But Lord, we know that love is about choosing what's good for those you love and dealing with the evil and separating it from those you love. It's justice. Lord, we don't have your heart of compassion that you have for those that we walk amongst who don't know this tidal wave's coming. Those who talk themselves into believing that they're probably good enough to survive any kind of waves on the shore. There's just no way. Lord, the evil one he's blinded a lot of eyes to the reality of what's coming. And Lord, you have given us a tremendous treasure in terms of understanding it. Understanding that judgment's coming. Understanding that there's a love from you that that is immense as well if we'll just reach out and embrace you and embrace the sacrifice Jesus did on our behalf and put away our own prideful thinking that we can somehow tread enough water that the tidal wave won't get us. God, give us your heart of compassion for those who are around, that we might not only warn about the coming catastrophe of judgment, but that we might offer an invitation that preserves souls, that brings life, that brings abundant life, and only life in your presence, only life in you, in fact. God, give us hearts of compassion to share that with eagerness and with urgency and with boldness. Thank you, Lord, that at one time in our lives you gave that message to someone near us and they told us. And we were amazed that in the midst of the debt of our injustice, you would pay the price to redeem us and to enjoy your loving kindness. So, Lord, make us those people now, we pray. Thank you for your word to us. And may you continue to transform us through it, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.